Part 35. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 341. The beauty pulled up a chair and sat down. She crossed her legs and looked at Chen Tao with her big eyes. What does this mean? Is she hinting at something? It's impossible. Chen Tao just saved her life. Could it be that in this way, he could win her heart? This is too ridiculous. So why does she stay? Stay in a man's room? You haven't answered my question just now, Pei said. What is love that you mentioned before? Hearing this, Chen Tao understood that Pei didn't want to have anything to do with Chen Tao. She was interested in the so-called old world things. Chen Tao said, actually, I don't quite understand love. To put it simply, it is when one person of the opposite sex develops a liking for another person of the opposite sex. Chen Tao looked at Pei's face and said, I want to see each other all the time. If I can't see him, I will feel very uncomfortable. Pei thought about it, crossing his chest with one hand and putting one hand on his chin. The way he was thinking about it was quite interesting. Looking at Pei's thoughtful expression, Chen Tao said, when you love someone, your mood will be very special. You will slowly start to want to do something intimate with the other person. Pei raised her face and looked at Chen Tao. Intimate matters. Chen Tao stood up and walked to Pei. Pei raised his face and looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao bent down and placed his hand on her chin. Pei was slightly startled. What are you doing? Hearing this, Chen Tao slowly lowered his face, looked at Pei, and said, I want to truly demonstrate something intimate with you. While speaking, Chen Tao's face was close to Pei's face. Very close. The noses seemed to be touching. Chen Tao could feel Pei's breathing and her heartbeat. Her breathing was a little messy, and her heart was beating much faster. Chen Tao looked into her eyes, and his eyes fell on her thin lips. Pei paid attention to Chen Tao's every move and also noticed Chen Tao's gaze. Pei suddenly panicked. At this time, Chen Tao slowly lowered his face. Pei quickly turned his face away from Chen Tao. She stood up and walked quickly out the door. Pei opened the door, paused slightly, and then looked back at Chen Tao. This is in the Holy Land, love is absolutely not allowed. What you just did, if others see it, both you and I will feel guilty. Violating the laws of the sanctuary is punishable by death. With that said, Pei walked out of the door and held her hand. Bang! The door is closed. See the closed door. Chen Tao stood with his hands folded across his chest. She didn't even know about love, but she would still react when he teased him. This reaction is really interesting. The end of civilization? Interesting. When he came here, Chen Tao certainly wouldn't want to stay in this small room. Chen Tao stood up, walked to the door, and walked out. Outside the door was a corridor with railings ahead. Chen Tao walked to the railing and looked down. People below were coming and going, busy with their own business. Other side. In Pei's room. Pei put on a thin shirt and lay on the bed. She looked at the ceiling above her, thinking about what had just happened. Thinking that just now, her lips were only a few millimeters away from his. Pei's cheeks turned red and he put his hand on his thin lips. What did he want to do? Pei didn't understand Chen Tao's actions at that time. Human beings' thoughts and kisses are restricted in the sanctuary. This kind of thing has never been heard of or seen since Pei was born. But when he thought about what might have happened just now, Pei Chen felt his blood boiling all over his body. Very strange. Pei closed her eyes, turned slightly to the side, and forced herself not to think about it. Other side. Chen Tao discovered a new humanoid mecha beside the street. This humanoid mecha was parked beside the street and looked very conspicuous. There is no one in this humanoid mecha, as if it was left alone. The reason why it caught Chen Tao's attention was that this humanoid mecha was different from the one used by Pei Ai and the others. Pei Ai could tell at a glance that those were heavy mechas, just like humanoid tanks, but the one in front of him was very thin and seemed to be light. What is such a light mecha doing here? Chen Tao, a survivor outside the sanctuary. Suddenly, a voice sounded behind Chen Tao. Hearing the sound, Chen Tao looked back. He saw a blond man wearing exquisite and luxurious clothes, holding a high-tech board in his hand. He looked at the information screen on the board, and then looked at Chen Tao. He squinted his eyes and said, I still don't know if there is a genetic defect, and I can't tell whether it's a lower-class citizen or a superior citizen. You'd better stay away from my mecha, otherwise you will regret it. With that said, the man handed the board to the follower next to him, and the follower took it. The follower was a man wearing a high-tech helmet. His right hand was a prosthetic leg made of steel. He looked 2 meters tall and his body was as strong as a bear. Chen Tao frowned. It turns out that this light mecha belongs to this man. The blond man stepped this way. He seemed to be planning to go to the light mecha. It's just that when the blond man came to the light mecha, Chen Tao was still separated. The blond man walked up to Chen Tao. He stared at Chen Tao and said, "Don't block the road, get out of the way." Chen Tao didn't move. This guy could have gone around Chen Tao by taking a detour, but he just ran straight into Chen Tao. It was obvious that he was looking for trouble with Chen Tao. Chen Tao didn't like trouble, but that didn't mean he was afraid of trouble. So, Chen Tao didn't leave. Seeing that Chen Tao didn't leave, the blond man narrowed his eyes and said lightly, "Really? You plan to go against the law enforcers as soon as you arrive in the Holy Land?" The blond man looked at the follower next to him. The follower walked out and walked in front of Chen Tao. He stretched out the mechanical arm, opened his big hand, and grabbed Chen Tao's head. The big hand grabbed Chen Tao's head and tried to lift Chen Tao up. But Chen Tao didn't move at all. Seeing this, the blond man was slightly startled. He looked at the follower and said, "Sode, stop playing, throw him out, so that he won't get in my way." Sode couldn't grab Chen Tao with one hand, so he let go and stretched out both hands to Chen Tao. The huge hand grabbed Chen Tao's shoulder and tried to grab Chen Tao. But Chen Tao still didn't move. Thord let out a low roar, and the muscles on the arm made of flesh and blood bulged. It can be seen that Thord has been exerting force, but Chen Tao still didn't move. There was a trace of doubt in the eyes of the blond man. "Lanson, what happened here?" Hearing the voice. Thord was slightly startled and let go of his hand. Thord and the blond man looked at the source of the sound together. Chen Tao crossed his arms and his eyes fell on the source of the sound. Chen Tao found that the people watching nearby also focused their eyes on the person who was speaking. Over there, a woman wearing a tight uniform and a high-tech helmet on her head. The woman was tall, and the tight uniform fit her proud figure, outlining an extremely proud figure. She was wearing a pair of high-heeled boots on her feet, which made her figure even taller. She held a black whip in her hand, and there was a blue light on the eyes of the high-tech helmet, just like her eyes. Her eyes looked here. "It's Jenna, the leader of the law enforcement team. Why is she here?" There was a discussion nearby. Law enforcement team? Chen Tao looked at the blond man, who called himself a law enforcer. In other words, the woman was on the side of the blond man. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 342. When the blond man saw Jenna, his expression became more solemn. He saluted the woman and said, "Captain." Jenna glanced at the blond man and said, "Lanson, what's going on?" Lanson said, "I was planning to drive the mecha back to the law enforcement department, but this guy blocked my way and wouldn't let me pass. So, I asked Sadr to teach him a lesson." When Lanson spoke, Zhen Na looked at Chen Tao subconsciously. She raised her hand. Following Jenna were two people wearing light mechas. One of them took out a board and handed it to Jenna. Jenna glanced at the board. What was displayed on the board was Chen Tao's picture and information. Survivors. Jenna handed the board back to the follower and said, I remember the last time I found a survivor was 30 years ago, when I was not born yet. Jenna looked at Chen Tao. I didn't expect that he would appear again 30 years later. Jenna crossed her arms and looked at Chen Tao. No matter what you are like outside, when you arrive in the sanctuary, you must abide by the rules of the sanctuary. Before you enter the sanctuary, you must undergo a genetic test to determine whether your genes are whether it's excellent or inferior. I'll decide where to live and work. Before that, I hope you can stay in your temporary residence and don't wander around and affect other people's lives. Chen Tao, like Zhen Na, crossed his arms across his chest, looked at Zhen Na, and said, What if I don't? With this sound, the onlookers all looked at Chen Tao. Is this person from outside the territory? Oh my God, he actually dares to resist the head of the law enforcement team. He is so brave. Jenna's face was hidden in her helmet, and her expression couldn't be seen. Seeing this, Sood took the initiative to walk out and walk towards Chen Tao. A slap hit Chen Tao's face. Chen Tao stepped on Sood's body, and before Sood's attack came, he kicked him. Bang! Accompanied by a loud bang. Sood's body flew 10 meters away, hit the wall with a bang, and the wall dented. Sood's body almost sank into the pit, unable to move. When Jenna saw this scene, she said, assaulting law enforcers, no matter who you are, has violated the laws of the sanctuary. Go. Behind Jenna, a man driving a light mecha came out. The light mecha was holding a white metal rod in his hand. After he came out, he pounced directly on Chen Tao. The metal rod in his hand hit Chen Tao's head. Chen Tao raised his hand. Bang! He caught the metal rod with one hand. With a sharp twitch of his hand, he pulled the light mecha and the people inside towards Chen Tao. Chen Tao kicked him out. Bang! There was a muffled sound, and the light mecha flew several meters away. Boom! The wall dented again, there was a footprint on the mecha's abdomen, and the mecha sank into the wall. Jenna frowned. Another light mecha flew out behind Jenna. Chen Tao stepped forward, rushed over, and swung his leg onto the head of the light mecha. The light mecha flew out in response and rolled a few times on the ground, unable to move. Chen Tao stood there, and the distance between him and Jenna was now less than 1 meter. Jenna clenched the whip in her hand and threw it at Chen Tao. Chen Tao stretched out his hand, grasped the whip thrown by Zhen Na, and pulled hard. Jenna's body was pulled over by Chen Tao. Chen Tao raised his other hand and wrapped his arms around the woman's waist out of habit. Jenna was startled, but found that she couldn't move. She struggled and said, Let me go. Chen Tao said, Let you go, let you whip me with a whip? I'm not that stupid. This woman named Jenna, although she is uncomfortable doing things, she has a really good figure. It feels quite good to be held in my arms, and it wouldn't hurt to hold her more. Chen Tao looked at Jenna's helmeted face and said, Girl, what are you doing wearing a helmet? Let me see your face. As he spoke, he raised his hand and touched Jenna's helmet with his fingers. Bang! There was an unusual sound. The high-tech helmet worn by Jenna shattered into pieces. Jenna's face appeared in Chen Tao's sight. This is a charming face, with long and narrow eyelashes and big red phoenix eyes. It is actually a beautiful face. Jenna's face was expressionless. She suddenly opened Chen Tao's hand and broke away from Chen Tao's arms. At this time, 2 blue dots appeared on Chen Tao's body. Chen Tao looked at the blue dot and turned back to the source of the blue dot. The 2 mechas that had just fallen had already stood up. They were holding white firearms in their hands, and their muzzles were pointed at Chen Tao. The blue dots were released by the blue dot lights that came with the firearms. Jenna raised her hand and touched her face. She looked at the metal fragments at Chen Tao's feet. She looked at Chen Tao and said, "What did you do?" When Chen Tao touched it, her helmet shattered. This scene is so weird. This is something Jenna can't understand. She wanted to find out. Chen Tao crossed his arms across his chest. He looked at Jenna and said with a smile, "This is high technology from outside the territory. Do you want to know?" "Unfortunately, I can't teach you." Jenna frowned. "You seem to have something that our sanctuary does not have, but it is a fact that you attacked the law enforcement team. People who attack the law enforcement team must be imprisoned for 3 years according to the laws of our sanctuary. Months. If you resist again, we will shoot you on the spot." Seeing Jenna frowning and looking cold, Chen Tao crossed his arms and smiled playfully, "Imprison me? Haha, I have never been imprisoned since I was a child. If you want to imprison me, you might as well kill me. Come on, shoot." Jenna looked indifferent, but she did not speak decisively. Bang. Suddenly, a gunshot sounded. A bullet shot at Chen Tao's head. A burst of fire swirled around Chen Tao's head. Chen Tao frowned, and he looked at the two mechas holding guns in front of him. The two looked at each other and looked at the guns in their hands. They were not the ones who fired the gun just now. Chen Tao slightly turned sideways and looked behind him. Behind him, the blond man named Lanson had already entered his mecha, and he pointed the gun at Chen Tao, with white mist coming out of the muzzle. Obviously, he fired this shot. Chen Tao's eyes slowly turned cold. How is it possible? Why is this guy not hurt at all? Lanson subconsciously took 2 steps back, his voice full of panic and confusion. Chen Tao narrowed his eyes, moved his body, and rushed towards Lanson. Lanson saw Chen Tao approaching. He was terrified. He pulled the trigger. "Don't come over." Bang, 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 all the bullets shot at Chen Tao, but only a burst of fire could be seen, and there was no scar on Chen Tao's body. Chen Tao waved his hand. The head of the humanoid mecha was slapped away, revealing the face of Lanson sitting in the cockpit. Lanson looked at Chen Tao in horror. Chen Tao's eyes turned cold, and he waved his hand. A head flew into the sky, and with a crash, it rolled to the ground. Blood dyed the ground red. Seeing this, the people watching around couldn't help but widen their eyes. "Ah!" Screams rang out, and the onlookers fled frantically. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 343. Chen Tao said calmly, "You took action before your leader said anything. It doesn't give your leader any face at all." He looked at Jenna beside him and said, "In order to prevent you from being implicated by him in the future, I will help you get rid of him first. No need to thank me." He smiled. Seeing Chen Tao's smile, Jenna's face changed slightly. "You, what kind of monster are you? Is this a monster?" The bullet hit Chen Tao, but Chen Tao didn't do anything. He casually killed a soldier wearing a mecha with his bare hands. This is too exaggerated. When Chen Tao heard this, he blinked. "I helped you, but you call me a monster. This is not good." Facing someone like Chen Tao, Jenna didn't know what to do for a moment. "Jenna," suddenly, a voice sounded. Hearing this familiar voice, Chen Tao looked over and found Pei Ai trotting over anxiously. Pei Ai looked at the corpse on the ground, and then at the messy ground. She frowned, then stood next to Chen Tao. She looked at Jenna and said, "Jenna, he is a guest of our group. You guys can't touch him." Jenna frowned and said, "Touch him? You don't even look at who is touching whom now. The body lying on the ground is not his, but mine." Pei Ai was slightly startled. She looked at Chen Tao and said, "What did you do?" Chen Tao crossed his arms, looked at Jenna, and said, I don't care what the rules of your sanctuary are. If you want to touch me, I'm just defending myself. If this guy wants to kill me, he must be mentally prepared to be killed. Pei Ai knew this was troublesome. At this time, a group of people wearing light mechas also arrived. These are probably also members of the law enforcement group. Jenna raised her hand and pointed directly at Chen Tao. He attacked members of the law enforcement team and killed law enforcement officers. You are here just in time. Catch him. After hearing Jenna's words, the group of people surrounded Chen Tao, and of course Pei Ai, who was standing next to Chen Tao. Pei Ai frowned and looked around. Countless blue-dot firearms were aimed at Chen Tao and Pei Ai. Jenna said, Soldier Pei Ai, get out of the way, I don't want to accidentally hurt you. Pei Ai frowned, stepped forward, and stood in front of Chen Tao. She looked at Jenna and said, I told you, this person is a guest of our group. Unless Captain Anqing agrees, if you want to kill him, just kill him. Step over my dead body. Chen Tao was slightly startled and looked at Pei Ai's back. Jenna frowned and said, he has violated the laws of the sanctuary by killing the people in my law enforcement team. He must pay the price, otherwise the laws will be meaningless. If you want to hinder law enforcement, then I will punish you as well. Catch him. Come on. Jenna's voice fell. The people wearing light mechas approached here one by one. Pei Ai remained motionless and protected Chen Tao behind him. Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai's profile and saw that Pei Ai was not the only one who abided by the laws of the sanctuary. Seeing a woman standing in front of him to protect himself, this scene was so novel. Interesting. Although this feels quite interesting, I don't like Chen Tao's style. Chen Tao stepped out, took 2 steps, walked in front of Pei Ai, and protected Pei Ai behind him. Pei Ai was startled. She looked at Chen Tao's back. Her eyes were filled with luster. What are you doing? If you hide behind me, they won't dare to kill you, but if you step out, you will die. Chen Tao turned his face slightly and looked at Pei Ai. He didn't say anything, but looked at Jenna in front of him. He said, one person does everything and everyone is responsible. Pei Ai is just fulfilling her duties. What I do has nothing to do with her relationship. Don't make things difficult for her. Pei Ai was stunned for a moment, her eyes glowing with luster. She looked at Chen Tao's back and realized that the man in front of her seemed much taller. Facing so many law enforcers, he actually dared to do this, and even wanted to protect her? Pei Ai's heart beat slightly faster. Jenna spoke up and said, shoot. Stop. As soon as Jenna's voice fell, another voice sounded. Hearing this voice, Jenna was slightly stunned, and she looked towards the source of the voice. There are 3 people standing over there. Chen Tao knew 2 of them, Anqing and Dimansha. The other one was an old man with grey hair. The old man was dressed in exquisite Chinese clothes and had 2 golden belts on his shoulders. He looked quite noble. Seeing the old man, Jenna was slightly startled. She saluted to the old man and said, Commander. He is the commander of the sanctuary. Leslie. Pei Ai's voice came from beside Chen Tao. Commander. Although I don't know what position this position is, seeing how respectful Jenna is to old man Leslie, it seems that the commander's position is not low. Leslie looked at Chen Tao and said, are you a survivor from outside the territory? Chen Tao crossed his arms, looked at Leslie, and said, yes. Leslie nodded slightly. He looked at Jenna and said, Chen Tao has just stepped into the Holy Realm and doesn't know anything about the Holy Realm. And I heard clearly just now that Lan Sen was the one who caused it first. It's just self-defense. It's no wonder that Lan Sen died. Jenna looked at Leslie and said, yes. Leslie nodded slightly. He looked at Chen Tao and said, Chen Tao, I heard that you saved my vanguard. I have to thank you for this. Hearing this, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, and he said, It's a small effort, so there's no need to thank you. Leslie stroked his goatee, looked at Chen Tao and said, I heard that you brought a giant humanoid mecha that was more than 10 meters high for me to see. See you. Chen Tao said, it's just outside the city wall. You can see it when you climb the city wall. Okay, Leslie nodded and said, let's go. Timensa, who was standing beside her, smiled and said, I'll lead the way. Leslie nodded slightly, looked at Jenna beside him, and said, Jenna, come here too. When Jenna heard this, she said, yes. Everyone follows Leslie. Everyone came to the city wall. Jenna looked down and saw the huge humanoid mecha below, her pupils trembled slightly. Leslie held his beard in his hand and narrowed his eyes. He subconsciously looked at Chen Tao and said, I also heard that you can remotely operate this humanoid mecha. Chen Tao crossed his arms across his chest, nodded slightly, and said, just watch. The giant humanoid mecha stood motionless, its slender eyes glowing blue. The giant humanoid mecha moved. Seeing this, old man Leslie's pupils trembled slightly. This technology, is enough to change the destiny of mankind. Leslie looked at Chen Tao and said, can you share this technology with us? My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 344. Jenna looked at the giant humanoid mecha below. She withdrew her gaze and subconsciously looked at Chen Tao. She just didn't understand why after Chen Tao killed a law enforcer, the commander still gave such great honor to an outside survivor and did not punish Chen Tao. He also said that Chen Tao acted in normal self-defense and was not guilty. Now Jenna has figured it out. Although the man in front of him is a survivor from outside the territory, he is different from other survivors from outside the territory. The survivors who entered the sanctuary from outside the territory in the past were all dressed in rags and could not contribute much to the sanctuary. But the survivor in front of him possesses technology that even the sanctuary does not have. If the sanctuary can master the giant humanoid mecha that can be operated remotely, it will be a huge help to mankind. Chen Tao looked at Leslie. This old man wants Chen Tao to share the technology he possesses with them. Leslie looked at Chen Tao, stroked his sheep's beard, and said, humanity is facing a huge doomsday test. Humanity is a community of destiny. All humans should work hard for the continuation of the human race. Now on this planet, almost all the remaining humans are concentrated in the sanctuary, which is the only hope for mankind. Leslie looked at Chen Tao and said, if the technology you possess can be shared with us, it will make a huge contribution to the continuation and survival of mankind. I hope you can share your technology with us regardless of personal interests and gains and losses. Chen Tao frowned slightly. He looked at Leslie and said, don't care about personal interests and gains and losses? Sorry, I am a human being and I don't have such a great sentiment. You may want to say that I am selfish, but others good. He looked at Leslie and said, it's impossible for me to provide you with technology without compensation. When Leslie heard this, he frowned. Suddenly, a faint sound sounded. A guy who is unwilling to contribute to the destiny of mankind, is really an extremely selfish person. Chen Tao looked sideways, and there was a handsome man over there. The man was dressed in white exquisite clothes, with blonde hair and white gloves. Behind him was a group of people wearing light mechas and holding firearms. This is Gen Si, the deputy leader of the law enforcement team. Pei Ai's voice came from beside Chen Tao. Gen Si glanced at Chen Tao, squinted his eyes, then smiled, looked at the commander, and said, Commander, please hand this man over to me. As long as he is captured, I have many ways to make him. He spits out the information we want. Leslie said, no. Upon hearing this, Gen Si frowned slightly. Leslie looked at Chen Tao and said, the person he handed over to us will not be a bad person. I believe he will consider the future of our humanity. Leslie stared at Chen Tao. Chen Tao, For human beings, the technology you possess is very important. I hope you can consider it, or if you have any requirements, you can put forward them. Require? Chen Tao looked at Leslie and said, technology, in fact, even if I provide it to you, you can't study it. The substance it uses is called Z3 substance, which needs to be extracted using a special method, and the extraction only my parents know the method, not even me. Chen Tao said, so, you can't make the technology I want to provide you with. However, I can provide you with some special technology. Special technology, Leslie looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao said, yes, the materials you use in the mechas you have now are too fragile. Some special monsters can break your mechas at any time and endanger the lives of the people inside the mechas. I can provide several sets of mechas that are more powerful than the ones you have, which can resist the attacks of those special beasts. Nonsense. Jensi looked at Chen Tao and said, the D1 heavy-duty mecha we have uses materials with extremely high hardness. It is extremely difficult for thunder beasts and special beasts to destroy the mecha itself. No, he's not talking nonsense, Pei Ai said. Noticing the commander's gaze, Pei Ai was slightly startled and lowered his head slightly, appearing a little nervous. The sanctuary commander plus 2 captains, a deputy captain and a squad leader are there. Pei Ai, an ordinary warrior, was not qualified to speak. Pei Ai, keep talking, Dimancha said aloud. Pei Ai was startled. She looked at Dimancha and said, yes, Captain. Pei Ai said, our team was carrying out the work of arranging safety barrier devices today. In the orchard, we encountered a strange beast that we had never seen before. It had a tail that was 10 meters long. The tail was it was sharp and could pierce the mecha and directly take away the lives of the soldiers inside. 2 of the 4 members of my team died under the attack of the special beast. It was Chen Tao who saved me. Humph. Jensi curled his lips and said, you spoke for him because he saved your life, right? Jensi Dimancha frowned and said, I don't care what else you say. But if you doubt the loyalty of my men, then I have to take care of this matter. Pei Ai, it's me. I have complete trust in the loyalty of my soldiers. Gen Si frowned and said, indeed, your resource group has made great contributions to collecting resources outside the city, but you should also be clear about everything. We have never heard of a special beast that can penetrate the mecha since the establishment of our sanctuary. If you don't believe it, Dimancha said, when the main collection team takes action tomorrow, you will go with them and you will see it then. Gen Si rolled his eyes and said, that is not my responsibility. He spoke loudly, but his expression was more withdrawn. The law enforcement group seems to be in charge of the laws of the sanctuary, but he seems to have no control over the laws outside the sanctuary. There was a hint of disdain in Dimancha's eyes, and she slowly withdrew her gaze. The commander stroked his beard, looked at Chen Tao, and said, what technology are you going to give us? Chen Tao crossed his arms and said, I won't provide you with technology, but I can provide you with ready-made humanoid mechas, which are harder than the ones you have. When he heard that Chen Tao was going to provide ready-made humanoid mechas, the old man Leslie's eyes lit up. Okay. That's great, Leslie said, I'll give you a research room and let you specialize in developing humanoid mechas. I'll send you a few more assistants to assist you. Chen Tao said, don't worry, I have conditions. Leslie was startled, he looked at Chen Tao deeply, and said, what conditions? Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai beside him. Pei Ai met Chen Tao's gaze, her eyes were shining. Pei Ai thought to herself, no way. He wouldn't make any excessive demands, would he? Chen Tao retracted his gaze and looked at the commander. He crossed his arms and smiled, I have lived alone outside for many years, and there has never been a woman by my side. Speaking of this, Chen Tao paused, looked at the commander, and said, so, if you want me to develop a humanoid mecha, my requirement is that Pei Ai be my woman. Pei Ai was stunned. He really asked that? And he asked something so excessive that it couldn't be more excessive. Nonsense, Jensi's face sank. Your request is simply unreasonable, and your actions completely violate the rules of the Holy Land. Relationships between men and women are absolutely not allowed in the Holy Land. You are challenging the authority of the rules of the Holy Land. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 345. Chen Tao looked at the sullen Gen Si, smiled slightly, and said, "Don't forget, I am from outside the territory, not from the holy domain. The laws of your holy domain have no control over me." As he spoke, Chen Tao's eyes fell on the commander, and he said, "I think you have a higher status here. It's up to you to decide. If you don't want to, it doesn't matter. If you are willing, you can give it to me in a short period of time. You have provided some powerful humanoid mechas, what do you think?" "Commander," Jensi looked at the commander and said, "he is flouting the laws of our sanctuary. It is impossible for us to agree to his rude request." Leslie stroked his goat's beard, looked at Chen Tao, and said, "Chen Tao is just living in the sanctuary as our guest. He is not a member of our sanctuary, and indeed he does not need to abide by the laws of our sanctuary." "Commander, this..." Jensi was stunned. He never expected that the commander would be so biased towards Chen Tao. Leslie ignored Gen Si and his eyes fell on Pai. He said, "Pai, are you willing to dedicate yourself to the Holy Land?" Pai was slightly startled and looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao looked at her, with a smile on his face. He looked very proud, as if he was bound to win. Pai didn't know what Chen Tao wanted to do. Pai has never heard of this term being a man's woman before. Love between men and women is prohibited in the Holy Land, and of course that aspect of relationships is also prohibited, so many things about Pai are a blank slate. According to Pai's understanding, she thought, he asked me to be his woman. This should be similar to his subordinate. In other words, if I agree, will I have to obey his orders in the future? Pai looked at Leslie and said, "Pai is willing to give everything he has for the sanctuary." "Okay." Leslie nodded slightly, "You are worthy of being a warrior of the sanctuary. We will always remember your contribution to the sanctuary. Then, from today on, you are Chen Tao's woman. He asked you to do whatever you do whatever you want." "Yes," Pai responded. She glanced at Chen Tao subconsciously, and then stood next to Chen Tao. Seeing this, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. He looked at Leslie and said, "Then it's settled. You should prepare a research institute for me as soon as possible. Before the research institute is sorted out, I will go to the place you arranged for me. I'll stay here temporarily and wait for news from you." "Okay." Leslie stroked his beard. Chen Tao looked at Pai and said, "Go back." Pai said, "Yes." She walked forward. Sensing Pai's tone as if he was responding to an order, Chen Tao was slightly startled. He smiled and followed Pai, watching the figures of the two people gradually getting further away. Jenna said aloud, "Commander, I have something to say." Leslie looked at Jenna. Jenna said, "My people had a conflict with him just now. We hit his head with a bullet, but after the hit, there was a fire. He did not suffer any injuries. And..." Jenna looked at Leslie and said, "He tore open the light mecha and killed the people inside. He did all this with his bare hands. The bullets are useless. And they can tear apart light mechas." Leslie frowned. "Monster, is this a monster?" Jensi frowned. He looked at Leslie and said, "Isn't he transformed from a special beast?" Dimanche said, "Jensi, you can't even accept the existence of special beasts that can destroy mechas. Now you can actually come up with such an unreasonable thing. It's really amazing." Tai Manza's voice was filled with mockery. Hearing this, Jensi frowned. Leslie pondered for a moment and said slowly, "No matter what, This man holds many secrets that we don't know. Those secrets may change the fate of mankind. His value is definitely not small. Jenna listened to Leslie's words. She turned slightly sideways and looked down at the huge thing that was more than 10 meters high. She also understood why Leslie would accommodate that man so much. At the same time, Pai sat on the motorcycle and put on a helmet. Chen Tao sat behind Pai in a familiar manner, holding his hands around Pai's waist habitually. Pai stiffened slightly, but this time she didn't refuse, started the motorcycle, and left. It didn't take long. Chen Tao returned to his room. Then I'll send you there first, Pai said. I'm going back. Wait a moment. Pai wanted to leave, but the voice from behind stopped him. She turned slightly sideways and looked at Chen Tao behind her. She said with confusion in her eyes, "Do you have any other instructions?" Hearing this, Chen Tao showed a faint smile and said, "You are my woman now, do you know what this means?" Pai said, "We don't have this term here, doesn't it mean becoming your subordinate?" Chen Tao blinked and smiled, "No." Looking at the mature and voluptuous beauty in front of her, she looked confused and confused. Chen Tao planned to tease her. He approached Pai, stretched out his hand, and landed on her cheek. He picked up her hair, covered her cheek, looked into her eyes, and said, "Remember the gene exchange center, what's the matter? Being my woman means that you have to cater to my wishes anytime and anywhere and have genetic exchanges with me." Pai was startled, and a blush suddenly appeared on her cheeks under the corners of her eyes. "This is against the laws of the sanctuary." Chen Tao withdrew his hand, crossed his arms across his chest, and said with a smile, "I am not from your sanctuary. I don't have to abide by the laws of the sanctuary. But now that you are my woman, you don't need to abide by it." Chen Tao looked at Pai, "So, do you know what we should do next?" Pai's cheeks were red. She finally realized now what it meant to be the woman to the man in front of her. In other words, Chen Tao's meaning was very clear. He wanted her to accompany him now. Pai was hesitant, but had no choice. Pai could only bite the bullet and enter Chen Tao's room. Chen Tao smiled and closed the door. Chen Tao turned around and looked at Pai. Pai stood tall and graceful in front of Chen Tao. Wearing a tight-fitting black leather jacket and his powerful figure, his charm was irresistible. Pai's cheeks were slightly red and she looked at Chen Tao. "I have never been to the gene exchange center. Whatever you ask me, I will do it." Although she had a shy reaction, it was obvious that she was really blank in this regard. Chen Tao looked at Pai and smiled, "Are you afraid?" Pai was slightly startled. She looked at Chen Tao, "It's a lie if you say you're not afraid. After entering the genetic exchange center, women have a chance of getting pregnant. Frankly speaking, I'm not mentally prepared at all. I'm not afraid." "It's a lie. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 346. Pai stood in front of Chen Tao. She was wearing a tight-fitting black leather jumpsuit that fit her figure perfectly. Her waist was full and the leather fabric tightly wrapped her slender legs. Under her feet were a pair of black cylindrical high-heeled boots. It made her figure even taller. Her long hair like ink was tied up, revealing her slender neck. Pai's figure and appearance are impeccable. Just like what she said, she was indeed a little scared. The cheeks under the corners of her eyes were red, and she lowered her head slightly, with an uneasy look on her face. After all, what she will face next is an area in which she has zero experience. Seeing Pai's expression, Chen Tao smiled slightly, crossed his arms over his chest, and said, "Don't worry." Pai was startled. She raised her face and looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao said, the reason why I said that to your commander is because I don't want to see you step into the gene exchange center. Chen Tao can help with this civilization. It doesn't matter. If Chen Tao wants to, Chen Tao can liberate the humans in the sanctuary, but Chen Tao does not intend to use his own power to completely change the current situation of this civilization. There are hundreds of millions of civilizations in the entire known universe, and he can't just help them when he sees them. Then those civilizations will be too dependent on him in the future. He is the king of the dragon civilization. According to people in the outer universe, he is the god of this universe. He is a god, but not a nanny. Therefore, he chose to help a little. He could help, but Chen Tao certainly couldn't help in vain. Therefore, Pei Ai has this condition. The reason why he wants Pei Ai is not because he really wants to occupy Pei Ai through trade, but mainly because it just so happens that Pei Ai is going to the genetic exchange hall tonight. Therefore, Chen Tao indirectly helped Pei Ai. Let Pei Ai not lose his body in such confusion. Pei Ai looked at Chen Tao and said, "You don't want to see me step into the gene exchange center, why?" Chen Tao said, "Why?" Chen Tao thought for a moment. Yes, why? It stands to reason that this is how the civilization works. Pei Ai followed the rules of the sanctuary and went to the gene exchange center to match with others and give birth to children with excellent genes. This is contributing to human survival. This is also the way the civilization operates, but by doing this, Chen Tao prevented this operation. Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai and said, "Because I don't like it?" Pei Ai was startled and said, "Don't like it?" Chen Tao said, "Yes, I don't like to see girls like you having inexplicable relationships with other men before they have experienced love." Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai and said, "At least, you have to be mentally prepared and willing to do that kind of thing. If you don't want to, I don't want to see you being ruined by others." Chen Tao said, "So, I use this method to break you out of the laws of the Holy Realm. In this way, you don't have to go to the gene exchange center today." Pei Ai looked at Chen Tao and said, "What you did troubled me a lot. I didn't intend to ask you to help me. Although I was indeed a little afraid to complete the task, I am a warrior and it is up to me to complete the sanctuary. Your mission is your calling." She paused for a moment, and then said, "Maybe your education is from the old world, which is different from ours. But, I can feel that you are doing it for my own good, and I am very grateful to you." Chen Tao didn't expect anything. He smiled and said, "You don't need to thank me. I told you that I only did this for myself. I don't like to see you going to the gene exchange center, so there will be such a requirement." So. Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai. He approached Pei Ai, raised his hand, landed on her cheek, and touched her gently. Pei Ai's eyelashes trembled, and there was a hint of nervousness in her moving eyes. She looked at Chen Tao. "Now the task given to me by the sanctuary is to let me be your woman, then, no matter what you do, I will cooperate." Chen Tao looked at those shiny eyes. Chen Tao could feel her nervousness. Chen Tao raised the corners of his mouth slightly and said, "Really?" His eyes slowly lowered and fell on her lips. Noticing Chen Tao's gaze, Pei Ai's face turned red. Chen Tao slowly approached her face. Pei Ai's heart beat faster. Chen Tao wanted to tease Pei Ai and see what she would do. But when the face was close to each other, Chen Tao could smell the fragrance of Pei Ai. You can feel her breathing and even hear her heartbeat. My breathing is a little faster and my heartbeat is a little faster. Suddenly, lips touched. Chen Tao put his arms around Pei Ai's waist and pulled her into his arms. After a long time, Chen Tao slowly let go of her lips. Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai's face. Pei Ai's eyes were closed, her eyelashes trembled slightly, and she slowly opened them, revealing her watery eyes. She found that her face was still very close to Chen Tao's. She also found that she had been hugged by the man, and her face was slightly red under the outer corners of her eyes. She looked at Chen Tao with big eyes. Is this genetic exchange? Hearing this, Chen Tao smiled and said, no, this is just the beginning. Just started. Pei Ai looked at Chen Tao with doubts in his eyes. Chen Tao said, yes, do you want to know? Pei Ai's eyes were gleaming and her face was red. She slowly lowered her head and rested her little head on Chen Tao's chest without saying a word. Chen Tao leaned close to Pei Ai's ear and said, I said, if you don't want to, I won't make things difficult for you. I don't want to see you do something weird when you don't want to. That's right. Chen Tao was confused. What had he done just now? Didn't we agree that as long as Ziyi Qing and the others are there, it's enough? I just wanted to tease her, but I didn't really intend to do anything. But now that's it? Chen Tao calmed down his emotions and believed that Pei Ai would not agree, so that would be fine. At this time, Chen Tao felt Pei Ai move slightly in his arms. He lowered his head and saw Pei Ai's raised face. Her eyes were looking at Chen Tao, and she moved closer to Chen Tao. Lips touched. All of a sudden, Chen Tao's head went blank, and every nerve seemed to be broken at this moment. Until now, Chen Tao remembered one thing. At that time, he just planned to tease Betty. And now it seems that the same mistake has been repeated. Pei Ai's trembling voice came to his ears, I want to know the whole process, can you tell me? Chen Tao whispered in her ear, I will tell you slowly. He held Pei Ai in his arms and walked towards the bed. Pei Ai rested her little head in Chen Tao's arms. She had no idea what Chen Tao wanted to do, so she could only passively cooperate with Chen Tao. Her only reaction was that her cheeks turned red. As someone who grew up in the sanctuary and was educated in the New World, these things were all violations of the laws of the sanctuary. She had never been exposed to these things, so naturally she had no way of knowing what was about to happen. She closed her eyes and simply thought about nothing. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 347. 3 hours later. Chen Tao gently comforted Pei Ai in his arms and looked at Pei Ai. Pei Ai's starry eyes were half closed under her eyelashes, her cheeks were slightly red, and the corners of her mouth were slightly raised, revealing joy. Seeing this, Chen Tao smiled. Pei Ai slowly recovered. She raised her face, looked at Chen Tao with her blurred eyes, and said, it's amazing. Chen Tao couldn't help but smile, another wonderful time. Pei Ai's face fluttered with 2 wisps of red clouds, and he hid his face in Chen Tao's arms. Let's not talk about it anymore, Pei Ai said softly, you said you want to help us develop several sets of mecha weapons that are more powerful than our humanoid mechas. Pei Ai looked at Chen Tao and said, can you really develop that kind of humanoid mecha? Hearing this, Chen Tao said, of course. Pei Ai looked at Chen Tao and said, if possible, can you also develop one for me? Upon hearing this, Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai and smiled, now you are my woman, your mission is to stay with me. Even if you have a mecha, you can't go out to perform missions if you put it on. Yes. As far as you're concerned, this mecha is useless. Pei Ai leaned her little head on Chen Tao's chest and said, I want to continue performing the mission. Chen Tao blinked, why? Pei Ai said, although I followed you and the commander agreed that you can ignore the laws of the sanctuary, I am a member of the sanctuary. The sanctuary is currently short of food and there are not many soldiers. I can contribute more, just do more. If the mission fails because I don't go, then people in the sanctuary will starve to death one after another. Pei Ai looked at Chen Tao and said seriously, I am a member of the sanctuary and I want to help. Hearing this, Chen Tao fell silent for a moment and looked into Pei Ai's eyes. She means it? It's not surprising that Pei Ai would think so. After all, she was born and raised in the Holy Land, and has been educated and baptized by the Holy Land since she was a child. Now that there is something going on in the Holy Land, but she is asked to enjoy it by Chen Tao's side, How can she possibly stay there? Realizing this, Chen Tao thought for a moment. He held Pei Ai's chin with his hand, raised her face, looked into her moving eyes, and said, "Now your mission should be to stay with me. Satisfy me anytime and anywhere. This mission is very important. Because of you, I will help them build humanoid mechas." Pei Ai was slightly startled and looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao said with a smile, "However, I respect your idea." Pei Ai's eyes lit up slightly, and she looked at Chen Tao. "You agreed?" Hearing this, Chen Tao said, "Well, I can create a powerful humanoid mecha for you to use, and I can also allow you to participate in the next sanctuary operation. But there is a condition." Pei Ai looked at Chen Tao and said, "Conditions?" Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai and said with a smile, "Yes, one condition is that when the task is completed, I want you." He touched Pei Ai's face with his hand and said, "I want you to put me first one, even if it's the safety of the sanctuary, you have to put it behind." Pei Ai hesitated for a moment and then said, "The commander asked me to follow you, then I am yours. I should have put you first." Chen Tao said, "Well, it's just that you were born and grew up in the Holy Land. It's impossible for you to put the Holy Land behind your mind. So, these are my conditions. If you want to go, then in the future, you have to put me first." He looked at Pei Ai, smiled and said, "Is that okay?" Pei Ai hummed, "Okay." She looked at Chen Tao and said, "As long as the food crisis in the Holy Land is over, I will do whatever you want me to do, and I will definitely listen." Chen Tao smiled, "Really?" Pei Ai nodded. Chen Tao said, "Then don't always beg for mercy from now on." Pei Ai was startled. She seemed to have thought of something, her face turned red, and she hid her little face in Chen Tao's arms. "Well, no. I won't beg for mercy." Her voice became softer. Looking at Pei Ai's shy look, Chen Tao's heart felt hot. Chen Tao was planning to tease her again, but at this moment, a voice sounded. "Dong dong." It's a knock on the door. Hearing the knock on the door, Chen Tao raised his face and looked at the door. "Chen Tao, it's me, Dimancha." A cold female voice sounded outside the door. Hearing this voice, Chen Tao's heart moved slightly. Pei Ai pulled up the quilt and sat up. She looked at the door, then looked at Chen Tao. "It's Captain Dimancha." Chen Tao smiled. He got off the bed and said, "Wait a minute while getting dressed." He put on his clothes and looked at Pei Ai next to him. "It's just that that's not how she wears her tight bodysuit." Chen Tao waited for Pei Ai to put on her clothes. Pei Ai raised her hand to straighten her messy hair and saw Chen Tao waiting for her. There was a hint of joy in Pei Ai's eyes. After tying her hair, she stood up and walked to Chen Tao. Chen Tao walked to the door and opened it. There was a beautiful blonde woman standing outside the door. She was wearing a bodysuit and a black trench coat. Although the trench coat was wide, her waist still stretched the trench coat high. The waist is very slender, and the legs wrapped in black stockings under the cylindrical skirt are very slender. The pair of black round high-heeled boots made her figure even taller. "This is Dimancha, the leader of the resource group." Dimancha crossed her hands under her chest and looked at Chen Tao. She glanced at Chen Tao and then her eyes fell on Pei Ai. Pei Ai was dressed normally, but Dimancha could keenly see the faint blush on Pei Ai's face. Moreover, Dimancha could also feel that Pei Ai had a mature temperament that only mature women have, which was somewhat different from the Pei Ai she saw in the morning. Dimancha's eyes fell on Chen Tao. She smiled slightly and said, "The laboratory is ready." Chen Tao said, "Okay." "Captain." Suddenly, a voice came from the side. Chen Tao turned his head to look. Pei Ai looked at Dimancha seriously, and she said, "I want to participate in tomorrow's collection operation." Dimancha said, "I did intend to let you participate, but you are Chen Tao's woman now. Your most important task now is to accompany Chen Tao." You should do whatever he wants you to do. This is what you should do. She said, you may feel a little uncomfortable, but your task is very important, more important than any other task. Pai was slightly startled. Looking at Dimanche's serious look, Pai was a little stunned. She didn't expect Dimanche to explain the importance of this matter so seriously. Pai subconsciously looked at Chen Tao. She thought, did I underestimate the importance of Chen Tao? Chen Tao smiled and said, if Pai wants to participate, let her participate. Dimanche was startled, and she looked at Chen Tao strangely. The reason why Dimanche emphasized this matter to Pai just now was that she was worried that Chen Tao would be uncomfortable. Now hearing Chen Tao take the initiative to speak for Pai, Dimanche was a little confused. Dimanche thought that Pai didn't want to be with Chen Tao, so she made such a request. Could it be, not? Chen Tao said, I respect Pai's ideas, and, I am also interested in the following collection tasks. Dimanche's eyes were shining, this won't work. You have to develop the mecha in the shortest time. This is very important for our sanctuary. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 348. Dimanche was worried about the progress of Chen Tao's development of mechas. Chen Tao crossed his arms across his chest, looked at Dimanche, and said, when do you expect to use those mechas? The earlier the better, Timensa said. It would be best if it can be manufactured within this month. Chen Tao looked at Dimansa and said, then just don't worry, no matter what I do in this month. In 1 month, the enhanced version of the mecha will definitely be developed. For Chen Tao, developing a powerful mecha is just an idea, and it takes less than a few seconds to create. The manufacturing of these mechas is even simpler than the weakest artificial humans Chen Tao has ever created. Timanza frowned slightly. She turned slightly and thought for a moment, the technology you have is the hope of all mankind. Your life is very important. Chen Tao said, I can survive outside the territory by myself, let alone now that I am with you. When Timensa heard this, she said, okay. She looked at Chen Tao, your giant mecha is also a kind of combat power for us. Our action tomorrow is to obtain food, which is very important for the Holy Land, which is currently short of food. In this case, then you and Pai will gather at my place tomorrow. Ye Chen Tao responded casually. Yes, Pai responded, his voice a little loud. Chen Tao couldn't help but look at Pai. Before that Dimanche looked at Chen Tao and said, you'd better go to my research institute. That will be the place where you lived before. Chen Tao nodded slightly. The two followed Dimantha. It didn't take long. Timanza took the two of them to a research institute. Men and women in blue uniforms were working back and forth in this research institute. The machines were intelligently and automatically producing piece after piece of metal material. Those metal materials looked like they should be the assembly parts of the mecha. The sound of mechanical movement was a bit loud, which made Chen Tao feel uncomfortable. Dimanche walked with Chen Tao and said, this research institute is divided into 3 floors. The first floor is a factory. This factory mainly produces mecha parts and assembles mechas. The second floor is the residence of the employees. The third floor is where the researchers live. This is on the first floor. What is currently being produced in the first floor is related to mechas. Dimanche looked at Chen Tao and said, from today on, the personnel of this entire research institute will be under your control. They will work with you to help you produce what you need. Captain Dimanche suddenly, a voice came. Hear this sound. Chen Tao looked forward. What I saw was a man. The man was wearing a brown vest. He had muscles all over his body. He was nearly 2 meters tall and looked as strong as a bear. As he came closer, the man smiled. Dimanche nodded slightly, hello, Director Ruijin. The man smiled, his eyes fell on Chen Tao, and he said with a smile, This is the researcher from outside the territory, Chen Tao, right? He stretched out his hand to Chen Tao and said with a smile, "Hello, I am Ruijin." Chen Tao looked at Ruijin's stretched out his hand and shook Ruijin's hand. Dimansha looked at Chen Tao and said, "This is the director of this institute, Director Ruijin. If you need anything in the future, you can come to him and he will satisfy you." Chen Tao let go of the strong man's hand and said, "What about my residence?" Ruijin said, "I will arrange your residence on the third floor, come with me." Ruijin took the three of them into the elevator and went upstairs. Arriving at the door of a room on the third floor, Ruijin picked up the room card and inserted it into the room's card slot. The door slowly opened. Entered the room. Chen Tao looked at it and found that this room was quite large, much larger than the accommodation he had arranged before. It also had floor-to-ceiling windows that allowed him to see the outside scenery. "Then I still have something to do." Dimansha crossed her arms and looked very embarrassed, and said, "Next, if you need anything, just tell Ruijin." Chen Tao nodded slightly, "Okay." Dimantha turned and left. Looking at Dimansha's enchanting back, she left the door. Chen Tao withdrew his gaze and looked at Ruijin. Ruijin looked at Chen Tao and said with a smile, "Are you satisfied with this room? If not, I can change it. However, on this floor, this room is already the best." Chen Tao said, "Fortunately, we and I are going to start our own research now, and you can go back." Ruijin was startled. He didn't expect Chen Tao to say that. He said, "Is there anything else I need to do here?" Chen Tao said, "No more." Ruijin frowned slightly and said, "But the order I received is that you have to develop a new type of mecha." This. Chen Tao looked at Ruijin and said, "I'm not here to deal with your questions, so I don't have to answer you. After that, if I need anything, I will tell you. Now I just need you to step back." Ruijin hesitated for a moment, nodded slightly, and said, "Okay, I'll go down first." After saying that, Ruijin looked at Pei next to him, and handed the room card to Pei. "This is the key card for this room." Pei took it and said, "Just give it to me." After Ruijin handed over the room card, he went out and closed the door with doubts. "Watch the door close." Pei's sight fell on Chen Tao. She saw Chen Tao walking to the French window and looking at the scenery outside. On the third floor, you can clearly see the scenery outside. Looking at the scenery of this planetary civilization, it feels very novel. Although it is the same human world, due to different development, the doomsday situation has occurred, and the arrival of the doomsday has bred humans who survive in the cracks. "Aren't you going to start making it now?" Pei's voice came from the side. Chen Tao turned his head slightly and looked at Pei beside him. She looked quite cute in a black one-piece tights. Her eyes were full of questions. Seeing this, Chen Tao smiled, and he didn't say anything. He just turned around, raised his hand, and a light humanoid mecha with a black body appeared out of thin air in front of him. Seeing this humanoid mecha that appeared out of thin air, Pei was stunned. The light humanoid mechas in the Holy Land are all white, but the mecha that appeared out of thin air in front of him is black and does not reflect light, which looks very deep. And this light humanoid mecha seems to have gender. It is a female humanoid mecha, which looks quite cool. But the question is, where did this thing come from? Pei subconsciously looked at Chen Tao. What's going on? She had too many question marks. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 349. Chen Tao looked at Pei and said, "What's going on?" Pei said, "Where did this thing come from? It just appeared out of thin air." "What's going on?" She looked at Chen Tao in confusion. Hearing this, Chen Tao smiled and said, "This is a high-tech program written using computers." "Programmed by a computer?" Pei looked at Chen Tao and said, "Aren't computers programmed? How do you program this kind of mecha?" Pei's face was full of doubts. Chen Tao smiled slightly and said, "The entire planet is a program, and all matter can actually be programmed with computers." Pei was confused by what she heard, and she shook her head. "I don't quite understand." Chen Tao looked at Pei. From this angle, he saw Pei's figure full of lines. The black bodysuit fit her perfect figure, and her waist was so thin. If you look down, you can see that the legs are slender and straight. Wearing a pair of black cylindrical high-heeled boots, her already tall figure was made even taller. Her long ink-like hair was tied up, exposing her white neck. Looking from Chen Tao's side, you can see her delicate profile. Chen Tao looked at Pei and said, "It's not important." He walked behind Pei, stretched out his hand, put his arms around Pei's waist, leaned towards her, and held her in his arms. His broad shoulders directly wrapped her slender figure. Pei's body stiffened slightly and slowly softened. Chen Tao's face was close to her ear. He could easily smell her body fragrance at such a close distance. He looked at the side of her face and found that the side of her face was red. Seeing this, Chen Tao smiled and whispered in her ear, "You just need to know that you are my woman and I will be good to you, that's all." There was a blush on Pei's cheeks under the corners of her eyes, and her eyelashes trembled slightly, looking particularly charming. Chen Tao said softly in her ear, "This is for you. Do you want it?" Pei was startled. She turned her face slightly and looked at Chen Tao's face. Chen Tao was hugging her, with his two faces very close to each other on this side. Pei's eyes were shiny under her eyelashes. She looked at Chen Tao and said, "Yes." Chen Tao smiled and said, "Let's give it a try." Although he was a little reluctant to give up, he still let go of Pei and took 2 steps back. Pei looked at the mecha in front of her. She walked over. She looked around the human mecha. She looked at Chen Tao, "How do I get in?" Chen Tao crossed his arms over his chest and said with a smile, "Its name is F1 mecha. Try reciting its name silently in your mind." Pei had doubts in her eyes, but if Chen Tao said so, she would do it. Pei Mo read the name of the F1 mecha. At this time, the mecha moved. The mecha dispersed automatically, and immediately flew towards Pei. Pei was startled and retreated subconsciously. Suddenly, the scattered mecha flew to Pei and reassembled on Pei. In the blink of an eye, the mecha was assembled. Pei's body is already inside the mecha. Pei saw a screen full of data through the helmet. She raised her hand and looked at her arm wearing a mecha. Her eyes glowed with luster and she subconsciously looked at Chen Tao, "This is it." Chen Tao smiled and said, "Isn't it awesome? I put your label on this F1 mecha. As long as you call its name, it will automatically attach to you and assemble automatically. This saves you the trouble. The steps you take to enter the mecha are very practical. The material of this mecha is different from the one you used before. It is not as thick as the humanoid mecha that looks like a tank, but it is extremely hard and can protect you from any harm." Chen Tao looked at Pei said, "Even if you encounter the strange beast from before, it will not be able to do anything to you." Pei suddenly dispersed in that mecha. The mecha left Pei's body and regrouped next to it. Pei looked at the mecha that flew away from her hands. Her eyes trembled slightly. She looked at Chen Tao and said, "It's so magical. I silently asked it to leave, and it broke away automatically." Chen Tao looked at Pei and could see the joy in Pei's eyes from his face. He smiled and said, "It has many functions, you can slowly explore it yourself." Pei came over and threw herself into Chen Tao's arms. She put her arms around Chen Tao's neck. She looked up at Chen Tao's face. Their eyes met. Before Chen Tao could react, Pei Ai raised his face proactively. After a long time, the lips parted. Pei Ai's cheeks turned red, and she looked at Chen Tao, her eyes filled with moisture, and her face was filled with excitement and joy. Chen Tao didn't expect that a mecha could make her so happy. Chen Tao smiled, raised his hand and hugged Pei Ai into his arms. Pei Ai blushed, hid her face in Chen Tao's arms, and closed her eyes. Chen Tao carried her to the bed. Unknowingly. It's night. Chen Tao opened his eyes, and everything was dark. In front of Chen Tao, Pei Ai had fallen asleep. She was like a kitten, nestled in Chen Tao's arms, with her eyes closed, sleeping soundly. Look at Pei Ai's sleeping face. Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, looking so cute even when he was asleep. Chen Tao couldn't help but moved closer and kissed her again. Release. Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai, but found that Pei Ai's eyes moved. She slowly opened her eyes and looked at Chen Tao with her big eyes. Eyes facing each other. Chen Tao smiled. There was joy in Pei Ai's eyes. She slowly hid her body in Chen Tao's arms and said, I really didn't expect that we could be like this. Chen Tao stroked her hair gently and said, why do you say that? Pei Ai said quietly, what we are doing is violating the laws of the holy domain. I am a member of the holy domain. If it weren't for you, I would definitely be sentenced to death if I did such a thing. She raised her face, looked at Chen Tao, and said, you liberated me. Is this love? It feels amazing. Hearing this, Chen Tao gently stroked Pei Ai's hair, and he thought for a moment. Yes, in this sanctuary, things like what Chen Tao and Pei Ai did are not allowed. If it weren't for Chen Tao's special technology and the survival of the sanctuary relied on Chen Tao's technology, both Chen Tao and Pei Ai would have been sentenced to death. Chen Tao made Pei Ai an exception in the sanctuary, but what about the other people in the sanctuary? Pei Ai closed her eyes, nestled proudly in Chen Tao's arms, and said softly, these things are called bad habits of the old world by us, but now it seems that they are really beautiful. It would be great if it wasn't the end now. She said dreamily. Listening to Pei Ai's words, Chen Tao's eyebrows relaxed slightly, and he gently touched her back to comfort her. He said slowly, it's going to be okay. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 350. Chen Tao kissed Pei Ai's hair, and gently stroked her back to comfort her. Pei Ai stopped talking and quietly nestled in Chen Tao's arms. After a while, Chen Tao could feel Pei Ai's breathing in his arms stabilized. She fell asleep. Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai's sleeping face, and he didn't disturb her, just watched quietly. Suddenly, there was a noise. The noise came from the first floor. Chen Tao was on the third floor, and the sound insulation on the third floor was good. Chen Tao shouldn't have heard the noise, but who is Chen Tao? He has the 6th generation of genes, and his 6 senses have long surpassed ordinary people, so he can naturally hear the noise from the first floor. Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai, she was sleeping soundly. Being with such a charming beauty, as a man, it is inevitable to think about disturbing her. Now hearing the noise from the first floor, Chen Tao just went out to relax and see what was going on, and at the same time he didn't have to disturb her sleep. After all, Pei Ai is just an ordinary person, she still needs to rest. Chen Tao got off the bed, put on his clothes, and left. Inside the first floor of the factory, a group of people were surrounding a place. In the crowd, a hot woman was whipping the man on the ground with a whip in her hand. This woman was Jenna, the head of the law enforcement group that Chen Tao had met before. Don't hit, the man shouted. The woman with a high-tech helmet held the whip in her hand and said coldly, a low-class citizen dared to tease a woman who is a superior citizen. According to the rules of the Holy Land, he will be whipped 20 times. As soon as the voice fell, the woman waved her hand and the whip fell on the man. Snap! The man's clothes were torn, and the flesh and blood were instantly blurred by the whip. The man screamed. Next to the man, there was a girl in white. The girl looked at the man with reluctance in her eyes, but she didn't dare to speak. Jenna whipped again. Snap! With a sound, there was another blood mark on the man's body. The man lay on the ground in pain, frowning. Jenna's whip kept coming. The people watching nearby were talking. If he keeps on beating, he'll probably be beaten to death. There's nothing we can do. Who told Moose to talk to Nina? The leader of the law enforcement group saw him. He's just a low-class citizen. Just beat him to death. Really, letting a low-class citizen come to our factory to work and contribute to the Holy Land is already a great honor for him. Who knew he would have such thoughts and tease the superior citizens? Not directly executing him is good enough. If he can't stand being beaten to death, he deserves it. Yes, he deserves it. He despised the laws of the Holy Land, and this man deserves to die. It's better to beat him to death. The discussion nearby was heard. Chen Tao's figure appeared in the crowd of onlookers. He listened to the discussion beside him and looked at the man being whipped in front of him. He crossed his arms. Was this noise caused here? Chen Tao looked at the man. His clothes were a little worn out, and now the worn clothes were covered with blood stains. The blood stains could be seen inside the torn clothes. The sixth whip, Jenna muttered silently. She was still standing straight, but she swung her hand and the whip flew over and hit the man directly. There was a blood stain on the man's body. The man frowned in pain. Chen Tao noticed that there was a girl next to the man. The girl looked at the man with worry and pain in her eyes. This girl was probably the one the man teased. The 10th whip, Jenna's strength was not low. Each whip hit the flesh heavily. By the 10th whip, the man's breathing was a little weak, and his struggle was not as strong as before. It seemed that he could not hold on any longer. Stop hitting, the girl suddenly appeared. She hurriedly stood in front of the man, opened her hands, and blocked Jenna's whip. Jenna frowned. Superior citizen Nina, what do you want to do? Nina said nervously and panickedly, he was just talking to me at the time, he didn't tease me. Captain, please let him go. If you beat him again, he will die. Jenna clenched the whip in her hand, looked at Nina and said, just talking? I saw him touch your hair with his hand, so is it just talking? Nina was stunned, her face turned pale, and she didn't know what to do for a while. Jenna said, now I am punishing him, but you are still protecting him, which means that you agree to him teasing you. In this case, you two have violated the rules of the sanctuary, and you should both be sentenced to death. Hearing this, Nina's face changed drastically, and she hurriedly said, no, no. Suddenly, Nina panicked. Jenna said, catch both of them. Two mecha warriors walked out and were about to go to Nina. Nina's face turned pale. A superior citizen actually agreed to the flirting of an inferior citizen. It seems that she was moved. She actually violated the rules of the Holy Land. Both of them deserve to die. Yes, both deserve to die. The discussion beside him entered Chen Tao's ears. Chen Tao frowned. He slightly relaxed his eyebrows and said, wait a minute. As soon as Chen Tao spoke, the eyes of the people around him, including Jenna, fell on Chen Tao. Chen Tao looked at Jenna. Jenna was wearing the symbolic helmet, so Chen Tao couldn't see her face. All that could be seen was her long golden hair and her S-shaped hot body. Chen Tao put his hands in his trouser pockets and walked towards Jenna. Jenna looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao stood in front of Jenna and snapped his fingers. Jenna's helmet disappeared. Jenna's beautiful face appeared in front of Chen Tao. Chen Tao looked at the beautiful face in front of him and smiled. He slowly raised his hand and approached Jenna's cheek, lifted her hair and placed it on her cheek. Although Chen Tao's movements were slow, he had irresistible courage. Jenna was unable to react for a moment. What are you doing? Jenna waved her hand and slapped Chen Tao's hand away. She took a step back and kept a distance from Chen Tao. Chen Tao looked at Jenna's cold face. Her face did not change at all, but there was a hint of anger in her clear eyes. Chen Tao crossed his arms and said with a smile, "You just said that the man lifted her hair, and then you defined that they violated the rules of the Holy Land and needed to be executed. Now I not only lifted your hair, but also touched your face. Does that mean that we have also violated the rules of the Holy Land and need to be executed?" Jenna said, "Nonsense, you forced it without my permission." Chen Tao looked at Jenna, he blinked, crossed his arms and said with a smile, "Really? I remember your commander said that if I need it, you will help me, right?" Jenna said slowly, "That's right, that's right." Chen Tao said, "I need a good mood to produce mechas. And now I am in a very bad mood because of your influence. If I am not in a good mood, I can't produce a good mecha." He looked at Jenna and said with a smile, "If you want to make me feel better, then you have to let me touch your face, do you agree?"